welcome back to my channel. And happy Christmas! If you're celebrating, I hope you had a good time so far. I hope you're enjoying yourselves. If you're not celebrating, I still hope you're having a good week. So today I'm going to go through my favorite books of 2020. We're getting to the end of the year. I assume I still might finish a book or two, but I'm going to go ahead and take a chance and hope that I have already read my favorite books of the year. So I have like a big pile of books here. I think they're probably around 20 books. So what I've done is I've sort of made 10, I think there is 10 categories, mostly based on genre. And I am basically just going to go through my favorite books or book in each category. In some categories there are multiple books. I think the most I have in one category is 4. And then there are other categories where I just have one book that I want to mention. And the books that I am going to mention also, they vary in like the rating I gave them. I think I've managed to include all my 5-star books of the year. But I also have books that were like 3.5 stars just because they were still my favorite in that category. And I'm not going to go very in depth with about these books. Many of them I've already talked about on this channel, and I'm going to link all of them in the description down below so you can look into them further if you're interested in that. So yeah, I think I'm just going to start going through the books. And the first category I'm going to talk about is fantasy. So for the fantasy category, I have picked out 3 books that I consider my favorites of the year. They are all 4.5 or 5-star books. There are 2 YA and 1 adult. So the first book I'm going to mention is The Red Scrolls of Magic by Cassandra Clare and Wesley Chu. Then we have A Storm of Swords, Part 1, Steel and Snow by George R.R. Martin. And finally, we have a book that I just recently read, and that is Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas. So, The Red Scrolls of Magic is a book in the Shadowhunter universe by Cassandra Clare. This series revolves around Alec and Magnus, which are my favorite characters in the Shadowhunter universe. And I have just been dying to read more about them because in the Mortal Instruments series, like they are there, but their storyline is never really that much focused on, I guess. Not as much as I would have liked anyway. So in this series you're finally getting some books that are pretty much just about them, and I love it. And I just think that I read this at just the perfect time, really, because at the start of the pandemic, I basically started watching the Shadowhunters TV series, and I have to admit I didn't have very high expectations for it. Like, I'd been putting off watching it for a long time just because I didn't really think I'd enjoy it. But then I finally decided to try, and I ended up loving it. I don't know, I got so into it, and I just love that Alec and Magnus' storyline are just much more focused on in that series compared to the books. So basically I watched that series in like April, I think it was, April, May, and at the same time I started reading this book. And I was just, because of that, I was so into the Shadowhunter universe at the time. I think that really helped with this book as well because I loved it so much. I gave it 5 stars. I have not given any other Shadowhunter book 5 stars. So I don't know, I think maybe the fact that I was just so into the TV series at the time might have affected my rating, I don't know. But like, I'm not complaining. If it made me love the book, more, then that's great, because I had such a good time with this, and I am really looking forward to read the second book in the series, which I hope I'll do in 2021. So this was 5 stars for me and one of my favorite books of the year. This book I've already talked about a lot on this channel. I read it in a reading vlog, so you guys know I was super into this. I gave it 4.5 stars just because it felt maybe a little bit like not too much was happening. But it is part 1 of a book, so I think that it will probably pick up in part 2, which I am planning to read in 2021. And finally, Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas, I also really loved. I read it in December, so it's pretty recent. I just loved so much about this. I loved the atmosphere, the setting, the characters, the storyline, the ending, like everything was just really good. There were some minor things about the writing that just didn't quite sit right with me. There was just something about, I don't know, the flow or something that just made it not quite perfect. So I haven't quite been able to settle on whether this is a 4.5 or 5-star rating for me. It's very high up there and it's very close to a 5-star. But it might be more of 4.5 star just because the writing was just a tiny little thing. But like, this is a debut. And for a debut, it was just really strong. So, like, I am expecting great things from this author in the future. And it did end up being one of my favorite fantasy books of the year. So, yeah, I absolutely love this one. And then we're going into the category that I have called sci-fi and dystopian. And for this category, I'm going to mention 2 books. I give both of them 4.5 stars. And those 2 books are The Toll by Neil Shusterman and Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. The Toll was one of the very first books I read this year. I read it in January. And this is the 3rd book in the, what's it called? The Scythe series. And I have really been enjoying this series. So I tried to read this book pretty soon after it came out. And it was great. It was just, like, I can't go into details about it because it's the 3rd book in the series and also because it's been almost a year since I read it, so I don't remember that much. But I remember just really enjoying it. It took some turns that I wasn't expecting. It was just so much going on and just, this is great. So if you haven't picked up the series yet and you are interested in a dystopian kind of series, definitely pick this one up. It's great. And then Station 11. So basically I read this at the start of the pandemic without knowing it was about a pandemic. That's really bad research on my part, but as you might know by now, I don't often know that much about books before I start reading them. I just know I've heard good things. So yeah, this is about a pandemic. It's different than what we're going through right now. This is much more severe, and it just has a lot bigger consequences on the world. But this was just, I don't know what I was expecting going into it, but this just wasn't what I was expecting. But I still really enjoyed it. I don't think I've read like any books quite like this one. It's just something about the writing and the way the stories, I should say, were built and the way they were told, and it was just really great. So if you haven't already read this one and you don't mind reading a book about a pandemic during a pandemic, then consider picking this one up. And if you prefer to wait, then you could probably wait until after the pandemic is over, but I highly recommend this book. So the next category is contemporary. And for this category I was going to mention 4 books, but then I realized just before I started filming this that one of the books that I was going to mention is actually not a contemporary, even though it reads like a contemporary. I'm still going to talk about it in this category, but I know it's not contemporary technically. And I think all of these books are YA. No, one is probably new adult, but the other ones are young adult. So basically I have Felix Ever After by Kacen Callender. I have Loveless by Alice Oseman. I have Far From the Tree by Robin Benway. And finally the book that is not a contemporary, that I accidentally put in the contemporary category, is They Both Die at the End by Adam Silvera. So let me just talk about Felix Ever After first, which is a book I've already talked about on this channel. I gave it 5 stars. It was amazing. It's about a trans guy, and it's about his different relationships in his life with his father, with his friends. And there's something happening at school that sort of really upset him when someone basically posted some photos of him from before he transitioned, and of his old name and stuff like that. And he is out for revenge. And it's just kind of messy, and it's just amazing in every single way. So if you haven't already picked up this one, I highly recommend it. It's also really, really well written. And then we have Loveless by Alice Oseman, which I'm not going to talk about. I've already made a separate reading vlog for this. You guys know I love Alice Oseman, and this book is about a Arrow Ace character, and for that reason it just meant so much to me, so it's definitely going to be on this favorite list. Then we have a big surprise to me. It's Far From the Tree by Robin Benway, which I listened to on audio, I think back in January. It was very early in the year, so I can't like talk about it in detail anymore. But this book just took me by surprise. I just picked it up, didn't know what it was about. I had it on my audiobook TBR basically because I'd seen it talked about on BookTube, so I just added it, and then I just started listening to it like without any planning whatsoever, and it ended up being great. The story was just like right up my alley, and it was just like great characters, and it was great relationships and all the things that I love in a good book. So yeah, this one was probably one of the biggest surprises of the year actually for me. I can't remember if I gave it 4.5 or 5 stars, but it was right up there. And then finally we have And They Both Die at the End by Adam Silvera, which, like I said, reads as a contemporary, but it definitely has some magical, supernatural elements that doesn't make it quite contemporary. But in this book, basically, you get notified, so to speak, on the day that you're going to die. So you get a call from Deathcast on the morning, like on the day you're going to die, and they basically tell you today is the day you're going to die. And there's like a website or an app or something for people who have gotten their Deathcast calls, so they can like meet up with each other and like support each other and stuff like that. So this book is about 2 guys who both get their Deathcast calls, and they meet through this app, and they just basically spend their final day together, and it's wonderful and amazing. And this book absolutely broke me. It was just like the title, basically it says like this title isn't lying. This is how the book ends, which is not a spoiler. But so I knew that the whole time I was reading this, and I went into it with a little bit of I wasn't sure if I was going to love it, because I don't usually tend to love like very depressing books. This one isn't quite that, even though you always have that sense of like you know it's going to end, but it's still just wonderful and amazing, and the characters are great, and it's just so good. I have loved all of Adam Silvera's books that I've read so far. I think this is the 3rd book of his that I'm reading, and I've given all of them 4.5 or 5 stars, so he's just great. I love his writings, and this book was just no exception to that. The next category is romance, and for this category I'm going to talk about 2 books, and both of them I gave 5 stars, and they are both 2 of my favorite books of the year. And we have Red, White and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston, who might actually be my favorite book of the year. And then we have Rule Breaker by Lily Morton, which is also just an incredible book. But yeah, Red, White and Royal Blue I read before I started my BookTube channel, and this was super hyped. Everyone seemed to love it, so I wasn't sure if maybe I would get disappointed when I read it, but no, this was great. I loved it so much, and it's a book that ever since I finished it, I wanted to reread it basically, and I will at some point. But this was just amazing in every way. I loved it so much. And then we have Rule Breaker by Lily Morton. This is another book that I read before I started my BookTube channel. It was my first book by this author, and I was blown away by how amazing it was. So this is a workplace romance, I guess. It's sort of like enemies to lovers. I mean, the first line of the book is is actually I want to kill my boss. So like that's where we're starting off. And it's just written so well. There's so much humor. I absolutely love the main character. He was just so funny and sweet and just amazing in every way. And the romance was just so incredible. So yeah, I still have only read this one book by Lily Morton, but I am so excited to read more from this author because I think this could be one of my favorite romance authors, because this book was just so good. And there are, I think, 2 other books in this series about different characters, not about these characters. And I have been planning all year to pick them up. I still haven't, but I am so excited to read those books as well because this book was so good. The next category is mystery thriller. And for this category, I'm actually just going to talk about one book. I went through the list of books, mystery thrillers that I've read in 2020, and like most of them were like 3 stars. I don't know if I'm super picky about books like this or if I've just been unlucky with the books that I picked out. But it's just been sort of like mediocre, the books that I've read so far in this category or this year. But the one book that I do want to talk about is one that I mentioned, I think, in my wrap-up for last month because it's a pretty recent read. And it's The Night Swim by Megan Goldin. This is one that I listened to on audio, and I definitely recommend that because the book is about a podcast and you get to hear parts of the podcast in the audiobook, so it definitely works very well in audiobook form. And this is a mystery that is just right up my alley. It's sort of small town, atmospheric. There are like different storylines going on. There's like past and present mixing together, and it was just great. It's sort of like a slower kind of mystery. It's not action-packed at all. And like, there are some surprises and some twists along the way, but it's not like that big dramatic twist that you never saw coming. It's not really that kind of book. It's more like slower. And yeah, it was just really, really good. I gave it 4.5 stars, something along that. So definitely recommend that one if you're into mystery thrillers. And then we have graphic novels. I don't read a lot of graphic novels. There's no really reason for that. I do tend to enjoy them when I do pick them up. It's just not that many, I guess, that I'm interested in. And I don't think it will come as a surprise to anyone who watched my previous videos which books I'm going to mention here. Surprise or not? It's Heartstopper by Alice Oseman, which I reread the first book this year, and then I read the 2 other ones for the first time, and I just love the series so much. It's super quick to read, but it's just Alice Oseman has a way of just like, there's some small details in these books that just makes my heart just melt, and it's just so pure and wholesome and just gives me all the warm, fluffy feels. And there are also some like more serious topics in here, especially in book 3, I think. But it's just amazing. If you want something warm, if you want something that will just melt your heart and something that will make you feel better and something that will make you smile, basically, then definitely pick these books up. Volume number 4 in the series is going to be released in 2021. I've already pre-ordered it just because I'm so excited, and there's going to be 5 books in total, so there's still some books to read in this series, and I just love it so much. The next category is historical fiction. This is a category I don't really read that much of, and I for a while didn't think it was really a category that I enjoyed, but I've realized that I am really into like more recent historical fiction, if that makes sense, like books set in the like 70s and 80s. So I have 2 books that I want to mention that are both sort of set in the not too distant past. I have Ziggy, Stardust and Me by James Brandon, and I have Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. So this one I already made a separate video about. It's a YA set in the 1970s, and it's just really, really great. It's about a guy who sort of like lives in a fantasy world, so to speak, just because he needs to like escape from reality. His life is pretty tough. And then he meets another boy, and there's like lots of like music references in this, and it's just written, it's pretty, the writing style was pretty different. It took me a while to get into it, but I ended up just really loving this book. I think I gave it 4.5 stars, so definitely recommend you check it out if it sounds interesting. And then we have Daisy Jones and the Six, which I picked up. I mean, this cover is just so lovely. But I basically picked this book up because I really, really loved The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, which I read in 2019. And it was one of my favorite books of that year. So I knew I wanted to read this one, and it just sounded really, really good. And it was really good. I don't love this book as much as I love Evelyn Hugo. Evelyn Hugo was a 5-star read. This was a 4-star read. I have been recommended to check out the audiobook for this one, which I think I will do at some point. This first time I read it in physical format. But I think it will definitely work really good as an audiobook, so I do plan to do that at some point. And maybe if I read it as an audio, I like it even better. But as it was, I did really enjoy this book. It's basically about a band, and I love like music documentaries and just stuff about bands and artists. So this was just right up my alley. It didn't maybe grab me as much as I would have hoped based on how I felt about Evelyn Hugo, but this was still a really, really good read, and like I said, I gave it 4 stars. Then we're moving on to classics, and this was a category that I wasn't sure if I wanted to include, just because both the books I'm going to talk about here were 3.5 star books, so not really favorite books. There are books that I'm not mentioning in this video that I enjoyed more than these two. But I decided to still include it just because I have read a few classics this year. And like, I struggle a little bit with classics. I don't tend to give them high ratings. I very rarely give classics 4 stars, and I can't even remember if I have ever given a classic 5 stars. So like a 3.5 rating for classics is pretty good for me, so I decided to include them. Anyway, I think I've mentioned both of them on this channel already. And like, I think they are considered classics. Like, I'm considered them classics anyway, even though they're more modern classics, I guess. So the first one is A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. And then we have Rebecca by, I always struggle with his name, Daphne du Maurier. So this one just kind of took me by surprise because I wasn't super enjoying it when I first started reading it, but it just grew on me a lot, and I ended up like really caring for the characters in this book. It's just a great book about like family and like growing up, and it takes place in Brooklyn and in New York in the early 1900s. I think it starts off in 1912. So yeah, this was actually really, really good, so I'd recommend it. And then I read Rebecca I can't remember when I read it, September maybe, which was a reread, but it was so long ago that I read it for the first time that I couldn't remember much. And this one I enjoyed, but I was just not happy, or I was kind of disappointed by the ending. I just felt like it was building towards something more than what we got. But the story was interesting, and I was enjoying this book. So I gave it 3.5 stars, and I would recommend it if you're into like gothic vibe kind of books. It was pretty good. So we're getting close to the end. I have 2 categories left. The first one I want to talk about is nonfiction. I did not read a lot of nonfiction books in 2020. So I'm just going to mention one book, and it's one that I've already mentioned in another video. I can't remember which video. But the book I want to mention is one called Sorted, Growing Up, Coming Out and Finding My Place, and it's written by Jackson Bird. I gave this book 4.5 stars. I really, really enjoyed it. I listened to the audiobook, which is narrated by the author, so if you're interested in this one, I definitely recommend the audiobook. It's basically about it's a guy who's sort of like telling his story as he is a trans guy, And it's basically about him growing up, figuring out who he is, and sort of finding his place in the world, being who he is. And it's just really, really good. It's very well written, it's very well. I was super engaged in the story, and it's definitely helped that he told it himself. And this guy is just, he is sort of, I think, pretty well known in the Harry Potter community or fandom. I didn't know him before I started reading this book, but I do think he has a YouTube channel. So I think it's pretty well known to some people. But even if I didn't know him, that didn't really make a difference. I still really, really enjoyed the book, and I highly recommend it. And finally, we have one category that I decided to add, even though I could have talked about these books in other categories. But I feel like they are kind of different. And the category that I decided to add is novellas. And I have two books that are novellas that I read this year and that I really enjoyed. So it's basically The Gentleman's Guide to Getting Lucky by Mackenzie Lee, and it's This Winter by Alice Oseman. And both these novellas are sort of set in universes or in series that I already really enjoy, which is the reason I picked them up. The Gentleman's Guide to Getting Lucky is basically in, I don't know what the series is called, but the first book is The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue, and the second book is A Lady's Guide to Petticoats and Piracy. And I just really enjoy both of those books. It's kind of weird because they are books where I really, really love the characters, but I'm not like super into the actual story. Like, it's kind of boring at times, and like if it was just a story, I probably would have given the books 3 stars. But I would give the characters 5 stars. So I've given the first 2 books in the series, I've given 4 stars. This one I gave 5 stars just because it's about Monty and Percy, and I just love them so much. And it's basically about it's what the title says basically, and it's just so sweet, and it's just precious, and just everything, and it's just so pretty inside, and I just love them, and I love this book, and this is one of the first books that I read this year. So like, again, can't remember details of it, but it was just precious and lovely and great and everything I wanted basically. And there's a new book in this series coming out, I hope this year, which I'm super excited to read. So this one, if you're into the series already, then definitely don't miss this one, even though it's a short novella, because it's great. And then we have a book that I've mentioned so many times on this channel that I'm just not going to go into it now, but it's This Winter by Alice Oseman, which I read in December, and I loved it, and it's set in the solitaire / Heartstopper universe, which I love, and it's about Christmas, and it's lovely, but also like sort of hard-hitting, and Alice Oseman is just incredible. She's one of my favorite authors. She's also, I think, one of the authors I've read the most books from this year. But yeah, this book, if you're already loving this universe, and Heartstopper in particular, then definitely pick up this book. So yeah, I mean, that was all. That was a lot. I have like books around me everywhere. So I hope you enjoy this format. I sort of thought about different ways of like wrapping up my year, but I figured I do have the tendency to favor some genres when it comes to like my highest ratings and stuff. So I figured this was sort of a way that I could talk about different types of books that I all enjoyed, even though not all of them were like 5 stars or like my absolute favorites of the year. But these are all books that I really, really enjoyed and that I would recommend others to pick up as well. So I figured this would be a good way to do it. So I think that's going to be it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon for another video. Bye!